So let's define some terms here, okay? Because this fake news is going around, and the president speaks of fake news. In fact, he calls the stories about fake news that comes out of Moscow allegedly fake news.
Right.
So
right. There's a double negative now about what fake news is.
So reports on fake news are fake. So let's talk. So help us understand what is fake news.
Yeah, I think that's a great starting point. So I think one of the distinctions we have to make is about reporting that is not fantastic, or reporting that is sometimes inaccurate, or in the case of cable news, where we report on a lot of breaking news, where the fact in the first instance in breaking news is never reflective of what the story is, because the world is one big broken telephone. But there's all that kind of stuff. There's accuracy and rigor in journalism. And then there's this deliberate attempt to misinform people. And there are many motivations for that. Initially, and this is why Donald Trump doesn't actually get to take credit for this, it was a commercial motivation. There was a way in which you could post fake news stories to the internet and people would click on them. And it was very, very profitable, because a click on the internet, when there's an advertiser associated with it, these advertisers don't buy ads in the traditional way. They are placed by algorithms next to a story. It's only a fraction of a cent one earns, but one can get hundreds of thousands of clicks to millions of clicks and make money by literally putting fake stories out there with headlines that people will click on. So that's the first category. The second category of fake news is fake news that is motivated by a desire to misinform people, change their opinions, politically motivate them. And that has become a lot more prevalent. That's what we're thinking about with the Russian interference into the election and many other areas. And the third part, which is perhaps the one that's becoming most dangerous, is the one you just talked about, where when someone doesn't like what you are reporting, they don't refute it, they don't debate it, they accuse you of lying.
Right.
They accuse you of being fake news.
Right.
And that happens with such frequency now. And by the way, Clifford, in my career, I have never seen that before about a year ago.
People even, I'm thinking of the president, but maybe others too, will anticipate the bad news reporting. Right. Bad news for them as fake.
Becomes fake news.
So
right.
we used to call this propaganda.
Right.
We used to call it propaganda, and when Pravda would do an article saying that President Nixon was a warmonger, maybe some people would have agreed with that, but nobody agreed with it because Pravda said it, right? No, we knew what Pravda was. Now, something has changed. There's social media. We're a more polarized society. What do you think has produced this?
Let's talk about what may be the same first, and to see how we get here. So remember that all of this conversation that we have had about the media being objective is a relatively new construct, right? In the time of the Civil War, in the times of the establishment of this country, newspapers were absolutely not objective. Right. They were owned by political interests and were propagandist. And then we emerged into this world with reporters like you and newspapers like the New York Times, which we believe represented some form of objectivity. So that's, we did get to a place where we thought there was objectivity, and we can debate whether or not there ever was, but there was a standard to which you were held, and if you as a reporter at the New York Times were accused of dishonesty, a few things would happen. There's an infrastructure at the New York Times that would question you at the very least, possibly investigate you, maybe take action, and then there is an ombudsman who might get involved and say, our reporting on that was not as thorough. So there was a sense of criticism around journalism. Now we've moved into a world where the cost of challenging the accuracy of your reporting or my reporting among one's supporters is very low. So, in the old days, if you accused me of lying, I could demonstrate that I wasn't lying, and I won the argument. Now, I'm not lying, I'm accused of lying, I now have to prove a negative.
Mm-hmm.
I now have to prove that my reporting wasn't a lie, which, by the way, in the type of reporting we do these days, it's very reliant on sources who we don't compromise for a reason, for very valid journalistic reasons. So it becomes convenient for someone to say, show us your sources. Well, we have an infrastructure that says I can't report using sources unless there's been a certain amount of due diligence to establish that that's valid. And that's not my choice, by the way, as a journalist. These are set up by your organization and mine. So when we report something, we're fairly certain it's true because we're fearful of getting sued or losing our reputation. That power doesn't hang over us anymore. That sword of being wrong or right doesn't have the same sway that it used to. Now you can accuse someone of lying,
right?
And it's not clear who suffers the consequence of being accused. Part of the problem, though, is that as we have moved into this world where there's so much media and people choose their own stuff on social media, the absolute trust in the evening news,
right,
or the New York Times or the Washington Post is not what it used to be.
Absolutely. I mean, I grew up, there were 3 networks. And I think a lot of people in this audience remembers those days. And when Walter Cronkite said something, we thought he wasn't always right. He wasn't even always objective. He had his opinions.
But you didn't think he was fully lying. You didn't think he made it up.
We didn't think he was lying. But there was a share. There was a community share. You would read your morning newspaper. You might even read an afternoon newspaper, and you watched Huntley Brinkley report. You watched Walter Cronkite. Now we're a polarized society, and that is reflected in our media.
Yeah.
And people ask me all the time, how could you have worked for the Wall Street Journal and then for the New York Times? And I say very, very easily. People go back and forth all the time. Maybe not on the editorial page, although now we have an op-ed.
No, but as reporters, people
As a reporter, not a problem.
And I don't remember the last time a Wall Street Journal or New York Times reporter was sued for inaccuracy.
Right. Now, Breitbart, I don't think I would get a job at Breitbart. In fact, I'm sure of it.
They're growing.
They're growing. But I think this is important. The polarization and also the mistrust of the media that did not exist before I was in the media, at least. Why is that? Why do people now are so skeptical of what we do? And that, I think, is part of this problem. So that if someone says that's fake news, people say, yeah, that's fake.
So 2 things I've done recently that have been instructive. One is my wife suggested that we watch All the President's Men again. And it's worth it if you haven't watched it recently, to go back and remember the way the Washington Post was accused by the administration of fabricating information and being on a witch hunt. It has echoes in some of the things that are said about the New York Times and the Washington Post today.
Right.
The second thing is my wife and I went for a visit to the museum in Washington, D.C. And we were reminded that this concept of mistrust in the media is often stoked by an administration when the narrative doesn't suit them, this one and others. And it is stoked by a feeling that the news doesn't always tell the greater story. It doesn't tell the story of my life. It's the story of something else. And increasingly, it has felt to some in this country, justifiably so, that it is the story of a certain class of people. It is the story, mostly, of the elites. And when we don't tell stories of the elite, I'm just being self-critical for a moment, it'll stop. When we don't tell some stories, or when we do tell certain stories of people who don't fit into our worlds, we talk about them as if they're a strange creature from a foreign land, that we've never seen before, some rare object. So we don't really own some of the major shifts that have been occurring in this country, and they are the displacement of the middle-class worker, the end of coal mining, many of the complexities around energy that you've covered, the story of gay America, we certainly haven't told the story of transgender America. the story of the deeply held prejudices against certain groups and women. So it's on the left and the right. People are angry on all sides that you tell stories that sort of suit you. You tell stories that are about those who are around you. When you're bored of the news, even your feature stories tend to be about the features that you enjoy, the Broadway plays, the things like that. And there was a feeling that an entire segment of America got missed out. And Fox News helped fill some of that gap. They decided they were going to tell the stories of a lot of people who felt that mainstream media had missed them. And I thought it was great marketing and great business. But what it ended up doing is it ended up putting people into corners.
Well, I think that we do in the media, we tend to be from the East Coast, West Coast, certain schools, and that criticism is on target. But the tectonic shifts that have been occurring that I have seen in my lifetime, I was born in 1953, right after World War II, because of civil rights, the Vietnam War, Watergate, tore apart the fabric of our country. And then you have the fact that the world is changing economically and leaving so many people behind, causing those frustrations, and people, it's hard to explain why things are the way they are. And it's hard to explain that as a journalist, and it's hard to understand that as a reader.
And there's a great series out right now by Ken Burns, The Civil War, in which he argues that...
Vietnam.
I'm sorry, Vietnam. He has a great thing on the Civil War, too. Vietnam. And in it, he suggests that some of the roots of this thing that we're experiencing now were established during Vietnam. But the counter theory to that you know about because you reported on it, is that this sense of the vast middle, or a big part of the country, feeling outside of the narrative that is put forward by mainstream media, is something that most Arabs will tell you is true. Something that many Europeans will tell you is true. It's a lot of the reason behind Brexit. It's a sense of the media and the elites and the establishment operate over here.
Right.
I live over here.
Right.
And there is no intersection between us. So while I agree there are real American reasons why this has happened, there is a global shift that may be occurring in part because of our, I'm an economics guy, so I see everything through a lens of economics. And the corollary to what's going on is that globally, middle-class wages have stagnated. The rich get richer.
So this is a phenomenon across the West. It's not just Russia, although they have very astutely picked up on it. Is it happening, are you aware of it happening in Asia, Africa, Latin America, to the same extent? It's certainly happening throughout Europe and the United States.
So where it happens is in places where the individual, the average middle, sees themselves having stopped in the track of progress. So why you don't see it in the same way and by the way, there are issues throughout many Asian countries, but where you don't see it, for instance, in India or China, is that there is still a lot of headroom. The average Indian and Chinese is not suffering from the idea that I'm out of opportunity. Now, in India, it manifests differently because a lot of people get an engineering degree and then move to the West to get a higher salary than they may have.
In China, you don't get a lot of freedom.
But you see, in China, we're still seeing movement from rural areas into urban areas. So there's still headroom. There's still place to go. What you saw, and I think the Arab Spring becomes so instructive, is that I did everything right. I went to school. I was told I could get a job. Maybe I even got a degree. I might have even got an advanced degree. And nothing is working for me in this society. In Brexit, you saw Britons, even though they fell for this banner, this poster they had that showed people walking, throngs of immigrants walking into Britain. Well, you can't walk into Britain. But there was some sense of years and years of post-colonial immigration into Britain was costing let's be honest, regular white working class people their jobs. And that's what happened here. It's this idea, somebody has capitalized on this idea that your misfortune is directly related to something. And if you ever go on to Breitbart and see it, you'll see, sorry about that. Is that you or me? You'll see that next to some stories in the headline, they'll have a little globe. It doesn't seem obvious why the globe will be there, but it is shorthand for globalists.
Right.
And the globalist is the enemy. So whether you're an Arab or you're a Western European or a Briton or an American, globalism, free trade, all that stuff has robbed you of your prosperity, and that's all the establishment. The media loves free trade, the establishment loves free trade, GDP is good when there's free trade, corporate profitability is good. Where's my increase in my pay?
And when we have more robots, people are not going to point to the robot. Or maybe they should. I think there's an elephant in the room that we haven't addressed, and I think we should. And it's sort of a two-part question, and that is the importance of fake news on the last election. Was it determinative? And if I can, morph into John McLaughlin for a moment, he used to say, Mort, remember Mort? From 1 to 10. Is 1 being a nuisance, 10 being a severe, urgent threat to our democracy and our Constitution? Where would you put it? So,
fake news or Russian interference?
Both.
I put it at a 7. I think this is very, 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 very serious. For a couple of reasons. One is, how on earth are you people supposed to know what's real and what's fake now? I mean, what education can we give people? People work. They have a life. They want to come home or look on their phone and find out what happened today. Now we have planted the seeds of doubt in your mind that when you pick up your phone and you look at news, that it might be untrue.
Right.
What are you supposed to do about that? Quit your job and spend your day researching all these stories?
Right, even when it is true.
Right. Once you've sowed that doubt, what do you do about it? So that's what
that's
are the
your
options?
truth. My truth is something different.
So what happens? Is there a potential that you will disengage from the news? Because we've heard that. We've heard people say that they do that. That is remarkably dangerous. In this day and age when we're talking about pulling out of the Iran deal and maybe war with North Korea and all sorts of other things, your margin for not knowing what is going on is very slim. You don't have one. Number two, what if we every day we hear news stories about these bot factories in Russia that were putting out stories on all sides of issues. So now we know that they weren't putting out stories that were necessarily exclusively in favor or that would cause you to want to vote one way or the other. They were putting them out on both sides.
On both sides.
Causing
Polarization.
unrest.
Right.
And the issue here is for Russia or anybody who does this, one's relative power in the world increases when someone else's relative power decreases. So the United States, in a state of chaos where senators and the president are in arguments, public arguments, and there's questions as to the validity of the election, and there are resignations from the administration on an ongoing basis, well, that is fantastic to other places that wish to relatively seem stable on a financial basis and on a political basis. So that's an achievement in itself. Once you've sown that degree of discord in someone's politics, they weaken. By definition.
They want to tear apart the Western alliance. The thing is if the Russians, I think, at least the people in the Kremlin, will say, you did this to us for years with Voice of America.
They would be correct.
And I guess the animus towards Hillary Clinton had to do with her siding with Democratic forces against Putin years ago.
That would be upsetting to them.
So, yes.
I know. I get the reasons for it.
And this is their answer.
Yeah.
But we need to understand that.
Yeah, and I remind people when talking about Iran that Americans think that our poor relations with Iran went back to 1979 when a group of religious fanatics took over the place. Iranians will tell you about 1953, 1954, when we overthrew their democratically elected president for asking for fair royalties on oil. They actually had democracy, and it was a CIA move that I think cost $1 million to unseat their democratically elected president and put someone in place who would continue to buy arms from the United States all the way through to 1979. We don't know these things. We don't typically talk about them. So there are a lot of places that are mad at American interference in their politics, and we have been doing it for a very, very, very long time. That said, this is really a problem. We have to address it. We've spied on each other for generations. We will continue to. But this business about social media infiltration is something we've got to take seriously. And part of the problem is we have an administration that doesn't want to take it seriously. We have social media companies that are worried about their profitability if they take it seriously. I remind people that in the 2016 presidential election, the top 20 fake news stories on Facebook got several times more viewership than the top 20 real news stories.
That's amazing.
On Facebook. It's a real problem. So it's a problem for democracy. It's a problem for truth in general.
It did have an impact on the election, I think. It's impossible to quantify that.
Possible to do. We don't have any evidence that any votes were changed, right? So that's the first thing we think about.
That we know, but apparently there have been some studies about shifts in some polls in certain states when there was more activity on social media.
Right.
So we know that. So, but it's really difficult.
But you can accept one without the other, right? You can accept that we have ample evidence that Russia, as part of a more than a decade-long campaign to achieve certain ends, interfered in our election, interfered in France's election,
right.
has interfered in other elections.
Right.
You can put that aside and say, that's serious and we should deal with that. And only if we acknowledge what happened there can we take a hard line on it. And you can separate that from whether or not the results of the 2016 election need to be discussed.
Right. There was even, apparently the Russians were helping the Green Party. I mean, the thing is this, I think as Americans, I think what we need to agree on is it doesn't matter which candidate they help.
Correct.
If they had helped to elect or tried to elect Hillary Clinton, for instance,
it would be as serious.
It would be as serious.
Yeah.
That's what's important.
And I think we have to get to the idea that this is really serious.
Because next time it could be the Democrats who benefit.
Right. But you know what? You just don't want, I mean, the basis, the beautiful strength of this country is its pluralism and democracy.
Right.
That is what is at stake. And by the way, both of those things are at stake, right? The whole concept of a pluralistic society is at stake because we have become, as you said, more polarized. Some might say we are reverting to tribalism in this country.
I think that's true.
And so the two things that make America the land that people will risk their lives to come to are things that, I don't want to exaggerate it, it's not falling away tomorrow, but these are things that are under threat.
I was recently, in the heartland in Wyoming, and it amazed me, I talked to many people about this, and it amazed me, people were saying, oh, you're overly concerned about Russia, they're not a problem, which amazed me, because I grew up, the Russians, the communists were the bad guys, right? Putin is this KGB guy. And that this is all kind of made up. And it was like an echo chamber that I hadn't heard since I was in Syria a few years ago, where I kept hearing, and these were good people in Wyoming. I really, really like the people of Wyoming. But when you get into these subjects, you would hear the same things over and over again, much like I heard in Syria or even Cuba. Although in Cuba, if you got away from the minders, you would then sometimes hear something a little different. But in Syria, where people really, there was this brainwashed, and I hate to say that people in Wyoming were brainwashed, but when you hear person after person after person saying similar things, similar lines, it worried me that there's a machine out there. I'm not saying it's a grand conspiracy, but there is this echo chamber.
Right. And it's on the left and the right.
Absolutely.
And the good news is that the only reason anybody in this country would be in an echo chamber is because they haven't found their way out of it, but there is a way out of it. Right? You can consume news in a way that causes you to understand when someone is being dishonest.
And I think most people are there. Most people. I think the people in this audience.
I think statistically you're probably right.
Most people.
I think there is somewhere between a quarter and a third of Americans that I worry about, who are using possibly a single source or two sources for their
news.
And
these are people on the left too. These are people.
No, there's a whole lot of people
said that,
who
and
do
I think
not
that's important.
get their information from, they don't triangulate their sources of news. So a perfect example I always hear, New York people love to talk about how the New York Times is a liberal rag or the Wall Street Journal is some crazy conservative newspaper. I mean, honestly, the reporting in these two newspapers on things that are not enterprise reporting or specifically breaking news, you could blindfold people and not know which one was which. These are high quality journalists who report on things, and then there's an editorial page, which again does not spread too far from the middle. This is not your crazy left and right in this country.
Center left, center right.
Right. We have a whole different politic in this country. We have sources of news that are, again, most of it's on the very far, I don't even want to call it right, because it's not really right. It's sort of a conspiracy fringe. And there's a left conspiracy fringe. It has become mainstreamed because of the internet, because of social media. These stories that would normally have been laughed at are now finding their way onto people's Facebook feeds. For instance, Hillary Clinton running a sex slave ring out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. that didn't have a basement anyway. Stuff like that would just be laughable.
That's how you know it's fake.
Stuff like that would just be laughable in the past. It gains traction. And there are people who are on the radio tonight who will continue to peddle that sort of stuff. That's not conservative or liberal.
That is fake.
Okay? That's fake. I'm not worried about conservative or liberal opinion. This country is based on opinion. You should have opinion, and you should listen to other people's opinions.
Right.
But the signposting about when the news stopped and when the opinion started is where we are falling down. Because you need to know the difference between when you read a news story or listen to a news report and suddenly when that became opinion. When that network changed to, okay, we were doing news, now we're doing opinion. I think that there is real value in consumers demanding from their media that you are honest about opinion versus news and what is paid for and by whom.
So I want to pick out a thread that you briefly mentioned, Facebook, Twitter. What responsibility do the social media businesses have?
The responsibility to not spread lies is absolute. They have squirmed their way out of this one in a way
without
that
censorship. It's complicated.
Yeah, but they've squirmed their way out of this in a way that you and I could not have, because they say we're not media. We are not content companies. We are platforms. Well, that would be fantastic if I could just decide that MSNBC was a platform. I have no media. I have no responsibility to.
Well, they're not producing it. They're just providing the space.
Right.
According to them.
So this is
it's different.
So Backpage tried this argument. Some of you may have followed this in the news. Backpage is just a platform for ads, right? Buy and sell stuff. How many of you have ever seen Backpage or used Backpage? Wow. So then I'll just tell you a little more about the story. It turns out that in addition to buying and selling your cars and all these kinds of things, there was an extensive section in which you could buy and sell personal services. Everybody's seen the back of a newspaper in their time. They know what we're talking about. It turned out there were a lot of underage girls being trafficked. And they were being sued for this. And they argued under the Communications Decency Act that they are a platform. They are not a content provider. So it is not for them to determine the veracity of the ad.
Very convenient.
Very convenient. There's lots of evidence that they knew that these ads were of underage girls. And before anybody tells me that they were consensual, we know the law says you cannot consent to underage prostitution. So this is still in the courts, by the way. It's been going on for years. It has not been settled. The courts, with the backing of Google and Facebook and Twitter, are not agreeing that there is a responsibility to not post ads that you know are of underage girls for trafficking. Now, I think to most people in this room, the answer to that one is obvious. But they're getting around it because the law says internet companies can describe themselves as platforms, not content providers. You, of course, could never get away with that. I couldn't get away with that because we are content providers. Yes. We curate, edit, and produce content.
Absolutely.
This is what they hide behind. And it is the same law that lets young girls be trafficked for sex is allowing lies to be perpetrated to an innocent public.
But it is complicated with Twitter, with all of the feeds that are going every day by thousands and thousands of people. And we love the fact that we're letting thousands of flowers bloom, lots of ideas. People who never had a voice now have an opinion that people could access,
the Iranian
which is a
Revolution
great
that
thing.
didn't fully happen was powered by Twitter. The
Absolutely.
beginning of the Arab Spring in Egypt was
all
powered
of this
by
is good.
Twitter.
So if you are the Twitter, and I'm just playing devil's
Yeah.
advocate with you, if you're Twitter, how do you draw those lines? And then I don't even know what kind of algorithm you're going to use, or are you going to be looking for buzzwords, or what? It seems like it would be an impossible task.
So step one is proof of identity, right? So with the Craigslist issue, a lot of it would have been solved if they forced anybody who placed an ad to prove to Craigslist who they were. Name, ID, and date of birth. Everybody can lie about these things, but the point is then you've committed a crime. Mm-hmm. If you're down there. So social media doesn't ask for that, right? We have no idea who these people are.
Right.
So if you just, and maybe there's a sophisticated identity system like they use in Estonia, which is
you can say you're Rex Tillerson.
You can say
anything.
So if we only first started by identifying who is placing what they called ads, we're calling them ads, but for all intents and purposes, they are stories, right? These are stories that are being put up. Facebook won't release them to us to examine. Let's just find out who's putting them in there. That's not for us to determine motivations or certainly points of view. I mean, we have standards, right? The law says that there are certain standards about decency and profanity and pornography and things like that. But beyond that, that's not generally what we're talking about. The problem ads that were put in by the Russians and others wouldn't have violated any rules except that they were lies. But if you knew that, you would be able to do that. So if you knew that it was coming from Pravda, you'd say, interesting story. They've got an agenda. If you watch RT on TV, some of the reporting is really interesting, but you understand that it's paid for by the Russian government. If you watch CCTV, again, they do some interesting stories, but you know it's paid for by the Chinese. I worked for Al Jazeera. I thought it was some of the best reporting I've ever done in my entire life, and we got Emmy nominations for it and awards. But you knew that it was paid for by someone, and if you watch the BBC or the CBC, you know that it's paid for by the British government, the Canadian government. Knowing where your news comes from, and who owns the New York Times, and who owns the Washington Post, and who owns NBC News, is relevant to the story. Mm-hmm. So if you're watching NBC News, which is owned by a cable company, and you never ever see any stories that are critical of the cable industry, you're invited to put two and two together. I'm not saying that's the case. I've never been told not to do a story in my life. But that is information that is valuable to the user, right? To understand who's telling the story, and so what filter should I use when...
And we learned this in school. I don't know if the kids... I mean, I have a child in 7th grade, believe it or not. They never talk about politics. They never talk about the elections. They never talk... Now, I remember being in elementary school, and we talked about President Kennedy, and we talked about Lyndon Johnson.
We did little mock elections.
Yes, we did mock elections, and we did votes, and of course everybody voted for whoever their parents voted for, right? In my household, it was always, my father was the Republican, my mother's the, so I had a problem. But we talked, and the teachers are afraid to.
Yeah, so we've had a lot of reasons why that happens, and we have to revisit how we look at civics. But as we look at civics, look, I've argued for many years now, since the financial crisis, that there needs to be some basic economics taught before people graduate from high school. But part of now what I'm realizing is that where would you learn how to consume news differently?
Right.
You never had to take a lesson in how to consume news.
We learned this in 5th grade.
Well, now but in when you were in 5th grade, they didn't even have cable. Kidding.
We had National Scholastic. But
the point is, you didn't have the same struggles, right? There were newspapers, and there was the nightly news, generally speaking.
Right.
We certainly didn't have cable news. It would be worthwhile investing on a community level at wherever it is one goes to take cooking classes or yoga or things like this, discussing how should you keep yourself safe from fake news by learning some techniques on your own. I do not think it's fair to put it on individuals to make this your responsibility, and I suspect that you bought a ticket to tonight means that you are probably pretty good news consumers.
Yeah.
But we have a part of the country that gets their news from one place. Now, I will say this always gets controversial, but it is a fact. The higher your level of education, the more outlets, there's a direct correlation to the number of outlets from which you consume your news. And so the problem is, at the lowest levels of education, you could end up with 1 to 2 sources of news, if any. And one of those might be your Facebook feed, and one of them might be radio or fringe elements, because you don't know how to triangulate. If I read 2 newspapers and listened to a radio station and watched a TV source, it's a lot of news. I would know if something didn't fit. I would know if a story appeared that didn't seem to be corroborated anywhere else. So if there's a big news story, typically speaking, it'll appear on a number of sources. So the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post may both cover the same story. It might be a slightly different angle to it, but you'll know it happened. But all of a sudden I've got this other source that's reporting all sorts of crazy things. And I would know that none of this crazy stuff is appearing anywhere else. So is there something wrong with this source that I should be thinking about? Now, I might come up to the conclusion that this extra source was Al Jazeera, or it's NPR, or it's a place that, for non-commercial reasons, covers stories that commercial media doesn't cover, right? That's different. You'll get different news from places that are publicly funded or government funded just because they don't have a profit motive to do that. But at least you should ask the question, why is it that I use 3 or 4 sources of news and one of them is a weird standout that has stories that might look like conspiracies? But if you don't consume more than one source, how would you actually know that someone's not telling you the truth? So we have to have some community level weapons to arm people. Now, I don't know how you're going to get to that 22, 23, 24% of America who believes fairly strongly in UFOs and believes that Barack Obama is a Kenyan-born Muslim. I mean, it's a number. It's still 22%.
Well, that's got to be a pretty large number.
I am, by the way, a Kenyan-born Muslim. And he wasn't at any of the meetings. He wasn't. Just saying, I would have noticed.
So, where should we take it from here? I've asked you all my questions.
Well, I will, if I could give you a quick anecdote.
Please.
It was, when was it? Was it this past New Year's Eve? We were in Florida with my wife, my kids, and my in-laws, and my phone went off with a couple of alerts that George Michael had died. You all know George Michael, right? And so I saw it from CNN, I saw it from the New York Times. NBC didn't have it at that point. So we were talking about it in the family. We were getting ready for dinner, and my wife and I my wife does what she always does when a celebrity or a singer's name comes up. She started to sing tunes by them. The kids were looking at me like, who's George Michael? And my mother-in-law was sitting at her computer and said, it's a hoax. I said, what do you mean it's a hoax? She said, look, there's an article right here. She pulled up some articles. She had Googled, as I had said, George Michael has died. She typed it in to Google, and she pulled up an article. Now, later on, we'll discuss why it is my mother-in-law felt the need to verify news that I had delivered. But she pulled up a story, and it said, George Michael death hoax, something like that. And I'm looking at this thing, some website I've never heard of in my life, never seen it, have no idea what it is. And I'm a little puzzled, because in my world, I do triangulate news. So now I've seen it in the New York Times and CNN, and the likelihood of both of those organizations making a mistake is very, very low, because we don't actually copy each other's news. We independently verify things like that. Somebody at the New York Times would have phoned somebody who would actually know this, and somebody at CNN would have done the same. Maybe they'd be the same person, and we'd say to our editor, I've got this from one source, and the editor would say, who's the source? And we'd have to tell them, and the editor would say, that's not sufficient. Or they'd say, that's sufficient because it's somebody who would absolutely know. So in many cases, we have to source things with 2 people, not just one. So I was pretty sure George Michael had died. So I'm looking at this article, I'm studying it. It has no real information in it, but it has the next day's date on it. So I'm thinking, that's weird. This is dated tomorrow. I think this is the hoax. And then one of our kids piped up with the fact that somebody said maybe it's from Australia, where it was the next day.
So
this is what I'm talking about. This is the kind of stuff that we're talking about. Clearly he was dead. But that's the kind of, like, who put that up there?
So you know, Ali, one of the benefits of this program that we're having tonight, I'm really glad we're doing this conversation, is that you would think that this would inoculate us. And when I say us, our society, we didn't know what happened during the election, right? I mean, President Obama, for whatever reason, really didn't get into it.
Right.
Was afraid to get into it.
Evidence is that he knew more
than he let in for whatever reason. That may have been a mistake. He thought it would politicize. He didn't think that Hillary Clinton was going to lose anyway. But now we know. We know that this happened. Can it happen again in not just the presidential election, but we have an election coming in, for Congress. It's going to be very vital. We have all of these primaries that are going to come out. Are we ready? And I'm talking about we as a society.
So I think there's two fronts on which we have to get ready. The first one is technological. We don't think any votes were changed, and we don't think election machines were successfully hacked. We better make sure that never happens. So we need to go back to the drawing board to make sure.
So that goes beyond fake news.
That's not fake news. That's just hacking. That's Russian interference or anybody else's interference in our electoral systems. Most people who voted in this country would agree it doesn't look like the world's most sophisticated voting system. So we had better make sure it actually is.
Yeah.
And part of the problem in this country is that it's 50 separate elections. It's not one presidential election. Again, most other countries have a national election for their most important offices. We don't. That is fantastic for all you home rulers here in the United States. It's really bad for technology. So we need to figure out how we do that. And that's a bigger conversation for people who are smarter than I am. But on the other hand, I don't think we're any further ahead. This conversation is really interesting. I'm touched that it was sold out. You know, a multiple of all the people who are here would not attend such a thing because they would think that it's not really, this isn't an issue. You're all making it up. It's the media who has contrived this issue of fake news. So I'm worried that it can happen only because we're not all in agreement that it's not going to happen.
Great.
So I think we have to.
But it must make a difference that we're talking about it to some percentage of the population. That because the great ally of this is the surprise.
It would be much more helpful if the most powerful elements of government would get on side with the fact that this is an issue. The federal government has established for itself that the most serious issue to deal with right now is this voter fraud of which we have no evidence. We have actual evidence of attempts to hack our system, so I would love it if that voter fraud commission would suddenly become a election security commission and we did real things about that.
Now, I have questions here. Do we really want to identify the people who've asked the questions? Does that bother
I assume they're telling
anybody?
the truth, so it's okay.
Okay, so this is that all right to name the names? We're all right with that? Okay. So this is from James Sides, who's retired. Is investigative journalism being harmed by the current antagonistic atmosphere, and will it survive?
Great question, and I'm very happy to say I think it's the opposite. I think that all of our news organizations that had been thinking twice about these investigative journalists, they're such a self-righteous bunch. They don't believe in deadlines, and they take forever, and they spend good money, and meanwhile I got to be on TV like 16 hours a day. They're back. They're back. Newspapers, which everybody said was dying, are back. There are people I know, I'm one of them, who goes out of our way to make sure we subscribe to newspapers so that those newspapers actually get the benefit of it and those reporters get the kudos for the work they do. If you watch MSNBC, we are populated, I think 50% of our guest lineup are reporters telling us about their stories. So I actually think this has reinvigorated some parts of the journalism industry that had been weakened over time because of budget cuts and consolidation. I think investigative journalism is coming back.
So here's an interesting question. No name on this one. To date, has more of the fake news been driven by financial or ideological motives?
Great question.
And is that changing?
Yes, it is changing. A year ago, it was almost entirely financial. And I was giving you, Clifford, a story a little earlier. I'll just tell folks. Say somebody posted a story on Facebook or Twitter or on a website somewhere that directed to these places that said Justin Bieber is moving to Houston. You'd click on it. Maybe you click on it. Maybe you don't even like Justin Bieber, but if some celebrity is moving to your neighborhood, or maybe let's say they got more specific, it said moving to this area in Houston. So you'd click on it because if he's moving to my area, it's going to affect my property values and traffic and whatever. So people would click on that story who would otherwise not click on any story to do with Justin Bieber. Then you change Houston to every other city in America. Then you change Justin Bieber to every other celebrity. And now you've got 1 million clicks at a 1/10 of a cent per click by somebody in their basement who doesn't have, never mind a journalism degree, they don't work, they don't do anything. And they will make more money off of that than you or I do in our daily work. So it was all financial.
I'm going to try this tomorrow.
You'll find it easy and successful. You don't need research like we do. You don't have to call sources. You just make stuff up. So now, and I worried when I did a TEDx speech last year about this, I said, what happens if that were to become something that was used for ideological ends or political ends? Naive little me asking that question. Well, that's the problem. So now we've moved into a world where it's more prevalent with respect to those types of ends. But remember, go on your Facebooks and check all the nonsense that's there. You may think you're not victim to this, and maybe some of you have fairly closed environments on your social media. Maybe some of you aren't on social media. But it is remarkable how quickly this can infiltrate you, where you think these are legitimate stories because, in theory, if you get your news from Twitter or Facebook, you have curated it, right? Because it's only from people you know. But didn't we all get weird emails from our sisters or brothers or uncles or aunts, those email chains warning you about things that are going to happen, don't eat your shingles because, bad things will happen to you, and you just sort of say, hey, uncle, just, stop with the crazy emails. Well, now that's mainstream. Now that's actually on your Twitter feed, and it's not this weird email that's been forwarded to you 20 times that, is all misaligned. It looks like a real story, and it looks like a story you might have written in the New York Times.
Right.
It's entirely fake. So my mother-in-law thought that perhaps George Michael wasn't dead because how do you know? You put in it's in Google. She Googled it. It showed up as the first thing in Google. Does Google bear some responsibility for that? It's a complicated question.
Yeah. So we're getting some very good questions here. So how can major news networks go on the offensive to work with social media outlets on this significant issue of fake news?
So I will say this. Google and Facebook have shown some initiative in trying to deal with this. I don't think they're nearly as robust as they should be. The European regulatory officials may force them to be, so they may make them police fake news in Europe, which will be the best thing that happens to us. Twitter is being remarkably recalcitrant about this. Worth noting. Twitter is not being forthcoming about this. I would say that the way I think about this...
We can tweet that, by the way.
Yeah, I mean,
it should.
So the media actually needs to be at the front end of it. We need to talk about what Facebook and Google are not doing properly and what Twitter's not doing properly. We need to bring that pressure to bear the same way we bring pressure to bear on politicians who we interview and people who don't tell us the truth on TV. The other thing is, I dream about this a lot, inventing some sort of algorithm where we use artificial intelligence to instantly fact-check a story, and that rather than me going to the NewYorkTimes.com to get the story or MSNBC.com, I imagine a website, let's call it realnews.com, where the combined ranking of the story that you just filed, because artificial intelligence has gone through it to prove that it's accurate, and your cumulative ranking, and the New York Times cumulative ranking sticks your story right at the top. So I am now choosing stories not because an editor thought it was the top story, but because it is judged to be the most accurate story in the world right now. And let's say we had translation engines on that. So maybe the most accurate story on a particular topic is an Italian newspaper, but it's so good that the algorithm has said, do that. What if instead of getting Peabodys and Emmys and Pulitzers for just the quality of your work, you and I got an award for being the most accurate journalist?
Oh, we would win every year.
And what if... But that would be to what you would aspire. So I think we have to recalibrate what we think of as journalists. We want to reward those people who are the most accurate.
So here's another good question. How can law enforcement get involved to combat fake news, or do we first need to designate lawful versus unlawful? This is a slippery slope.
It is, and we don't have laws that are being broken at the moment. That's what the issue is. So it goes back to the Craigslist thing, right? Their argument is we have the protection of law.
First Amendment.
There is an argument, but this is a very obscure protection they're talking about. We have to make sure that we didn't inadvertently, when we first started to regulate the internet, we must imagine that when we first regulated the internet in 1994 or 1996, whenever it was, that we didn't know what the internet was going to do. So like financial regulation, we probably have to update what it is. It is a slippery slope. What we do not want, we want a robust internet. We want absolute freedom of speech. We want people who otherwise didn't have a voice to have a voice. We want people to be able to criticize the New York Times and NBC News. We want people to call out our biases and our inaccuracies. So we don't want to squash any of the fantastic stuff that the internet brings us. But we do need to figure out the dangers that lurk within.
There's something, so it's something akin to libel.
Yeah, so it's not a job for law enforcement at the moment because there's no law.
There is no law
to enforce. But these do have to be important discussions to be had.
But if there's a conspiracy to manipulate our democracy,
so that falls under conspiracy law, and that's
espionage.
That's right. That's a different story.
Espionage.
So then the internet just becomes a tool that was used. And that's the argument that a lot of the
views. And if you accept espionage to help your candidacy, that's a problem.
That is correct. But that's not the internet doesn't get punished for that. Facebook doesn't get punished for that. So that's where the trick is. How do you cause Facebook and Google and Twitter and everybody else to be more responsible about content without fundamentally affecting the great parts about social media?
So another good question. These are all great. How does Asia and Europe deal with fake news differently than the United States, both government and major news outlets?
So let's start with Europe. Europe is very aggressive about this. The European Commission the European Union is very good at doing this. In fact, every major charge you've seen brought against the social media companies about things they've done wrong. I'm not advocating that we go around charging our social media companies. I think they've done a lot of great for the world, and they've given a lot of people voice. But Europe is really good at antitrust behavior and protection of the public behavior. So we want to look and see the examples. And I think the Justice Department does look ahead to Europe, and the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Communications Commission looks to Europe to see where they're going. Because obviously if you impose rules like that on Google or Facebook, their argument is that it's impossible to do this. The beauty of us being in 2017 is we don't think anything's impossible. So we look to see whether there are methodologies that can be used to clean up the internet a little bit. Asia is different because Asia is a lot of different places, but some of which don't have any freedom of press, some of which have remarkable growth in press. So again, the two big examples I always use are India and China. India has not only a massively growing press, but it's actually print or print equivalent. It's digital newspaper stuff. Indian cable TV is a disaster. It makes our breaking news look like a log burning, a Yule log. It's just crazy. Watching Indian TV for about 6 minutes, your head will actually explode. Pakistani TV. So and then China, where the debate is a different debate in China, right? It's propaganda versus blogs, right? They're bloggers who say that you can't trust state media. They might be right. They're probably right.
So give us space. And China has interestingly not shut down on everybody who is critical. They are trying to navigate this. They're trying to figure out how we let some critical media exist. And that's a work in progress, so we have to check back in to see. The third bucket in Asia are Muslim countries, which have a uniquely bad record with media, largely because they don't like critical media. Right. Media gets critical of them, so the net effect is to have it ends up being censorship, even if you're trying to just avoid one thing. So what ends up happening is it squelches a lot of voice. But what you do find, and I'm always fascinated by this, whenever, Clifford, you and I have probably both been at these awards ceremonies where they award these intrepid journalists for putting their lives in danger to report stories. And they always end up being from these places that have remarkable censorship or government control. There are reporters in parts of the world that just on a daily basis risk their lives, in many cases lose their lives in telling of stories. And many of them are across Asia. And so two things are happening. There are more attacks on journalists than there have ever been before. With each passing year, more journalists are killed in the line of duty. It's completely going the wrong way in terms of journalism and free press. But the beauty about journalism, can't snuff it out.
You know, I've never known a government, at least in a Western democracy, that enjoyed the press, that liked being covered.
They're not supposed to like it.
And that includes, in this country, I remember how, President Clinton just hated the New York Times. Hillary Clinton thinks that the New York Times defeated her, which some people think is laughable.
People bring it up all the time. They say, you guys never do this with any other administration. So we do this with every administration.
Yeah, we do this with every. And as a matter of fact, I can tell you that I was in Washington and covering the first Bush administration was so much more open than the Clinton administration. I would say that was the beginning of less and less.
And you see it in
you could call anybody in the Bush administration.
So we see it in little ways. This administration had talked about moving the briefing room off campus. To actually off the White House premises. I mean, it's a terrible thing. If you ever see the briefing room, it's the old White House swimming pool. It's just a horrible little space. Tiny, and more and more people every year want to be in it. It is, nobody likes it, but to be in politics in this country, you have got to understand that it is the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. It's even bigger than that other amendment that most Texans think is the First Amendment. Which is actually the Second.
It also shares. It's with freedom of religion.
Right.
It's the same amendment. It's freedom of assembly.
Right. It is what we do. I sometimes think, and I don't mean this to be critical of the form of government we have, because I think it's pretty good. In parliamentary democracies, they're more used to it because there is an established opposition party that badgers the government in the way that we are meant to do in the United States. So take some pressure off.
I can tell you that at least when I was covering Canada years ago as our bureau chief, I could not believe how the Canadian government treated the reporters. I mean, it was miserably. Leaving them in the cold, and, literally in the cold.
I don't know where the place is where it's good to be a reporter who's critical of government. But that's okay. We sign up for that.
And we're not popular anyway.
No, we sign up for that. So we can't shirk our responsibilities, and we can't get too upset that the government gets mad that we're doing what we do. If a lot of people are mad at us, things are all right.
Well, great. That's something to think about. So I think are we out of time, or do we have another?
No, we got another.
We have 5 more minutes. What do you want to talk about?
So
how about flying? Let's go back to flying. No, just kidding.
So I have.
I may have some more questions here.
One of the things that I often tell people about is mistakes versus inaccurate, deliberately misleading information. So when I worked at CNN, my boss had a view that when there's breaking news, we all know about it, and it would be much easier if we would all call into the desk and offer our services than for him to try and hunt us down, because he suspected that when there was breaking news and you saw the phone ring and it said CNN, maybe if you were at brunch or something like that, you just weren't that anxious to answer the call. So I got into the habit of calling from wherever I was, and there was a shooting at the Empire State Building some years ago. And I happened to be in Hanoi. And so I called in immediately, and I said, what do you need? And he's like, don't be an idiot. You're in Hanoi. I don't need anything. So I said, all right, well, I'll
This is the capital or the restaurant?
No, the capital, the country. I'm in Vietnam.
Okay.
He says, you can't help us from Hanoi. It's okay, you said call in, I'm calling in. So I was tweeting out everything that CNN was putting out, but this was in the early days of Twitter, and they just weren't formulating their tweets very well, so I couldn't easily retweet it. So I had to retype each tweet on my own. So the most important one comes out, this is from CNN, breaking news, FBI says no nexus to terrorism in Empire State shooting. That's the one everybody's waiting for, right? Every time something happens, you want to know if it's terrorism. So I couldn't tweet it out because it wasn't, it just didn't have enough space. So I retyped it, and I wrote, breaking, FBI says nexus to terrorism in Empire State shooting, said. Fastest retweeted tweet in the history of tweets. And it took me about 2 minutes before somebody emailed me and said, I think you need to check that tweet. So I checked. I said, what's wrong with it? Oh. So I deleted it, which is very bad etiquette on Twitter. Deleting a tweet is not something you're supposed to do. It's a sense of, there's a sense, I don't know where it comes from, but that when you tweet something, it's published. So it's the equivalent of, you can't just take down a story. You have to explain why you took down a story if you take it down. Is there a correction? But in this case, it was just spreading so quickly because everybody else was actually reporting the real story, that there was no connection to terrorism. I wrote that there was, just because I missed 2 letters. I missed the word no. That was the day I learned the meaning of the word no. And so I deleted it, and then I looked at everybody who had retweeted it, and I tweeted on top of their tweet to say, my mistake, fat fingers, no connection to terrorism. I went through this whole, it was 300, 400 tweets.
Oh my God.
So at some point I called our PR people, and they said, yeah, you know what, we got things on our hands, like you've blown up our switchboards. Why is CNN the only people reporting this? I said, well, what can I do? They said, really nothing would be great.
Resign.
But they said, look, you're doing the right thing. At least you are. I said, well, look, if there's any pushback to this one, throw me under the bus. This is all me. There was no CNN. Because a couple people had started writing. These bloggers work very fast.
Oh, God.
That it seemed to be a CNN thing. And I had to write to everybody and say, it's not a CNN thing. It's just me. I made the mistake. And ultimately, it got turned around into a fairly positive story about, people wanted to pick up on the story of what did you do, how'd you do it, how fast did you do it, and then I turned it around and all ended up well. I really worry if that had happened today, what the difference would be. We are not in a forgiving environment about these things. No. And by the way, I shouldn't have made the mistake. I'm not asking that people be forgiving, but we went from the criticism of me having fat fingers and not reading my tweet properly, which is valid criticism. We've moved into a world where that would immediately be a story about how I'm peddling fake news and nothing I do can be trusted.
I have my own personal story on this sort of thing. Just before, I think it was just before Rex Tillerson was nominated Secretary of State, when he was being talked about, there was somebody who was masquerading as Rex Tillerson on Twitter. And this person wrote something that actually seemed very, very reasonable. I don't know what it was, but something like, always happy to serve my country.
Right.
Whatever. So I retweeted it. And it turned out that it was a fake Rex Tillerson.
Right.
This became a story that I retweeted the fake, that I was fooled.
Right.
And if you Google, I think you'll find it somewhere. And it was like, I laughed because I immediately realized whatever, but it was like, this was a story.
Right.
Not a big story.
So
not as big as your story.
You're being fooled.
Yeah, it becomes a story.
Now morphs into, how does that affect your credibility? That's what the difference is today.
Yeah.
In the old days, it would have been,
it was pretty small.
Yeah.
Because if he had said, bombs away, we're going to get Korea, and I had retweeted that.
But that
would have been something else.
But
I wouldn't have believed.
Right.
I wouldn't have.
Right. You think
I would not have believed
right.
That's
be
true.
happy to serve my country.
So let me, as the moderator, I'm going to soften this question a little bit because it's a good question. No. It's not insulting. It's a good question, but it's stated in a way that's not diplomatic.
Right.
But here, so when the president, but it's not about you personally. But when the president accuses you, or say the media, of constantly creating fake news, how do you deal with that? And do you, so if you're saying, oh, it's not fake, you're getting into the mud with the President of the United States.
Got to be careful of that.
And you don't want to do that.
So we've had an example just this week. On Wednesday, I was in Las Vegas to cover the shooting. And so last Friday, I got into a bit of a discussion / argument with the head of FEMA about Puerto Rico. Now, we've been covering, I don't know if any of you have seen it, I've been covering these hurricanes for many, many years, and certainly the last 4 here in the United States. And I think FEMA did a good job here and in Florida, and the guy who runs FEMA has really got his, he's got solid experience. Tom Bossert, who works in the White House for Homeland Security, he's got a lot of disaster experience. But we had teams in Puerto Rico who were telling us that it is not what the government is saying. It is really, really bad. So I addressed this to the head of FEMA, and he repeated something that the White House had said the afternoon before. I'd never heard it before, that these are media, this is media misinformation. Mm-hmm. So this is their new fake news term,
right?
Media misinformation. Mm-hmm. So I said, so I sandwiched the FEMA director with 2 of our reports about Puerto Rico, and I said, look, somebody's lying here. That's our person in Puerto Rico. They're on the ground. And the truth is, so he said, well,
that's a tough word.
And he got really defensive, and he said, well, why don't you go down and see for yourself? So I got on a plane, and I was in Puerto Rico on Sunday, where 5% of the power has been restored to the island. I think we might be up to 15% right now, all of which is in San Juan. There's no power anywhere else in Puerto Rico. About 30% of the phones are working. They have no particular power generation in Puerto Rico, and their electrical grid is basically destroyed. The administration was lying about this. Bottom line, but then I'm busy trying to get into the story, and I'm headed to the worst hit place in Puerto Rico when my phone rings and says, you and your team have to get to Las Vegas. So we get on a plane and go to Las Vegas. And our reporting on what was going on with Tillerson and the president at that point was that Tillerson had used some very colorful language in describing the president.
Moron.
That was the second word. The first word, which I won't say, was yet more colorful. It starts with an F.
Oh.
And so we had this reporting. And the president came out and named us, and said NBC is fake news.
Right.
Tillerson came out and gave a strange platitudinous speech about how he would. He didn't say it, by the way.
He did not deny it.
He just said he's never thought about quitting and all
he's
that.
He's a boy, not a Boy Scout, Eagle Scout. He's not going to lie.
Right. He's also not inclined to throw somebody under the bus. It's just not his way of doing business. So the president continued with this. So he then starts tweeting it about NBC News. It should be investigated by Congress. Now this starts to get into dangerous territory. It's like, really? You want us investigated by Congress? So I put out, because I've got a fairly large social media following, I just put out a tweet that quoted the president's tweet. And that's dangerous business to start retweeting these things. Yeah. But I did say, I said NBC News stands by its reporting. And that was it. And you can't go down that road because the president has time and inclination on his hands that I don't have. But, the fact is it gets confusing to my viewers because the president said NBC is fake news. Didn't happen. It's a lie. So at some point, you have to make a decision as to, do you get involved in this conversation? Right. Do you avoid the conversation? Generally, I prefer to avoid it. I'm a bit impulsive, so I get into these Twitter arguments with people I think are bots. I respond, and then I find like they've got endless time to respond. Like I just thought it'd be witty to have one response, and 16 responses later, I'm like late for my show, and so engaging in it is a complicated
You're
issue.
too busy to tweet that much.
Yeah, that's true. My kids remind me of that all the time. It's like, could you just get off of Twitter?
Yeah.
Thank you, Ali and Clifford. What an insightful and entertaining conversation. We get back.